When I learned how to write as a child, it was revealed that I had poor fine motor skills. The school took my mother aside and explained to her that despite this, I should be able to have a normal career because by the time I was an adult, everything would be on computer anyway. And history has proven them correct in this. I think in a world where everything is handwritten, there's a limiting factor imposed on individuals with poor handwriting. But that some professions could get away with it, like ones where the practitioners are routinely over the genius gap, like doctors who have notoriously bad handwriting. So people who maybe aren't quite so bright would have been precluded from the kind of administrative type of roles in the economy. My dad said something that alluded to this. He said that he thinks there were a lot more 130 IQ janitors in the world when he was young because there was less upward mobility in the economy. But I think the examples of individuals who are exceedingly bright for their position, it may be because there's some part of their capabilities that doesn't quite fit in and precludes them, even though they may have a lot more to offer in terms of creativity or communication skills. But maybe like the technology wasn't there to overcome the bias against the kind of the optics of being less capable, created by poor motor skills, poor handwriting. So in my case, it was in fact true that by the time I was entering the workforce, everything was being done on computers. So I wasn't judged and limited by my handwriting. Along the same vein of thought, when I was in college, I minored in math, and so I took a fair number of math courses. And one of them was one taught by a professor who had either gone to Yale or had taught at Yale. He was a good professor, I guess, on paper, and I think he was a pretty good teacher overall. But he was tricky. Like at the beginning of class, he made the students sign an honor code saying that they wouldn't collaborate on a particular project that he was about to assign. And this was at the beginning of the class, the course itself, rather. And so the project was to create an ordinary least squares regression with a data set that he would provide. And so he handed out the data set, and from that data set, the students were to come up with an equation, a regression equation that fit the data, a linear regression. So sometime after the projects were turned in, a day came where he called certain students to stay after class. And I wasn't called, but I learned from another student that those who were called to stay were confronted with the fact that the regression equation that they turned in was for the wrong data set. He had handed out data sets that looked identical but were slightly different. So you could end up with data set A, B, or C. And so if you ended up with like regression equation C, but you were given database A, he would know that you had collaborated. So I don't know what became of those students, but he was a crafty teacher. He had a hypothesis for grade inflation, though, that we had to test against some statistics that he provided, some data that he provided. And his hypothesis was that teacher reviews created grade inflation. So the idea was that the fact that the students could bring repercussions against the professor based on the grade, their reaction to a grade, the hypothesis was that there was grade inflation as a result. Like the teachers would kind of acquiesce to the demands of the students, lest they be poorly graded in the review process, or their student input. And of course, it correlated strongly and had a very low t statistic. But I thought of something else at that time with regard to grade inflation, and that is if the expectations remain constant and the technology that's provided to do the work improves, you should have an increase in productivity and quality that could result in higher grades. So at the time, in the mid-1990s, that might not have been totally apparent. But now, as we get toward kind of the extreme of the augmentation of human intelligence with technology that may eventually have agentic capability greater than a human being. It is. I had occasion to attend a graduation recently, and when I was in university, summa cum laude was an extremely rare designation. I don't know what the statistic was back then, but perhaps at a small college there might be a handful in any graduating class. But this event I attended, seemed like about every fifth student was summa cum laude. And there were a fair number of magna cum laudes. There were actually far fewer cum laudes. So it's almost like there was a bimodal distribution where there were a large number at the top and probably a large number who were middling in terms of their GPAs. There wasn't a lot of like B average, it seemed like. Perhaps it was A's and only high C's, but there weren't many like cum laudes, which is, I think, a 3.5 GPA up to magna cum laude. But it does seem, at least in this anecdote, it seems like there's been great inflation, at least at this particular university, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's more widespread. So perhaps some of it is great inflation from teachers, but the phenomena was observed in the 90s. And if it got the attention of this professor back then, it may have been in full swing, you know. It may have reached that point of diminishing returns if there was one. So since then, what likely has changed more than the propensity of teachers to grade soft based on student reviews is the technology that students have to output material. As in my case, with my poor handwriting, by the time I was in college, I could write papers with word processors and the teachers would never know how pathetic my handwriting looked. The only time I couldn't do that is in certain large courses, like a History 101 type course where you had to actually handwrite your answers. And history was my best subject. So when I had to handwrite answers in that course during essay portions, I was graded poorly, I think, based on my handwriting. In the subjects where the handwriting was not known, or at least it didn't matter, like in mathematics, it's either right or wrong. It doesn't matter how bad the handwriting is. I did much better. So I think that I am part of a kind of a hidden cohort of people who have the capacity to do more intellectual work, but perhaps in generations previous, the combination of poor motor skills and perhaps a lack of social connections would have relegated them to positions for which they'd be overqualified. Just like any other kind of discrimination, the impact it has on a group of people. Regarding the ability of AI to augment human capability at work, for my particular role, which involves a fair amount of written communication and verbal communication, I have found it to be a sledgehammer where maybe I would need a fly swatter. It's available to me, but I have found that human attention has so atrophied that you really lose people after 3 sentences. You just have to be able to compress ideas. And I know I am verbose in these videos. I use a lot of words, but I feel like that's my luxury here in this format. But professionally, I have to get my point across in 3 sentences or I lose them. And I find that I'm creative enough to build those 3 sentences in likely less time than it would take to build some kind of prompt and then edit the output. So it's kind of overkill for me. The thing that gives me some comfort relative to being replaced by agentic AI is that there is some value in my role to a face-to-face interaction. Like, I am a guy who actually has to get in a suit and perhaps go to a company and talk to its executives. And if I'm talking to you about business and it's important enough, I've done some recon on you. I've talked to people in my company who've interacted with you. I've read notes in my company's CRM about you. I have gone onto the internet perhaps and looked at your profile somewhere. And while I'm sure an AI could build a dossier on a person, there are individuals who are not keen on having their data harvested, and so they're a bit of a mystery to any kind of algorithms. And a lot of those people are business owners. They're people who place a premium on their privacy. And so the only way to learn about them is face-to-face and through word of mouth from other human beings. I'm just not convinced that a ghost in the machine will very soon have the ability to just take in the whole landscape of associates, clients, and prospects for a business. There will certainly be tasks that it can replace humans for, and there are certainly ways that it can augment a human's capability such that fewer humans will be needed. But until little companies have AIs that will communicate with those of big companies, and even then, a human decision maker is going to be at the helm, and one AI could persuade a human being as well as another, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm sure there are differences between actual programs, but a lot of the AI functionality that comes out of business software is kind of commonly sourced, like how, you could have an outboard motor that was made by like Nissan or Tohatsu, but they came from the same factory. They're just a different brand. AI seems to be that way. They're powered by some engine. So your AI versus your competitor's AI, talking to the AI of the company, there's just like no differentiation. Then it becomes a price and perception of value, which I guess it already is. But a human being is often the differentiator in whether or not a company chooses a particular vendor. Like just about every time I've ever sat in front of a company and they told me they were looking to change providers, it's been related to the relationship. Like the person they were working with got moved away, or they lost their ability to interact with an individual and instead got put to a call center for too many things. Human beings like to work with human beings. You can still really throw off a chatbot in a conversation. Like there's nuances to the way people communicate and what they're trying to say. People use idioms. But maybe this is all just like cope, but I don't know. I do want to be ready to not need to work or to be retired. I'm getting old by the time they replace me with some robot. I'm seeing lately that AI is changing things on message boards. Not that I'm a huge participant or reader in message boards and comment sections. I see them. I guess they interest me somewhat because sometimes somebody with some actual knowledge will participate and add to the content that was originally presented. But all too often, there's just the same idiotic comments you see over and over again. Like, nuh-uh, is what it amounts to. Like, I disagree with you, but I'm not going to present any evidence to counter it, or I'm going to call you names. But lately, I can see where people are leveraging AI into comment sections. So you'll see on a message board these long-winded but well-written answers that are the meat of an ad hominem sandwich. Clearly, a person is using AI for the meat of that sandwich and their emotions for the bread. The thing is, from a rhetorical perspective, to take an hour to read and respond to such a thing as this AI-generated comment that was generated in 5 minutes, most of which was the handcrafting of the insult, is akin to shooting down a $600 drone with $1 million missile. It's stupid to do battle in comment sections anyway. But the advent of this, along with bots, cedes that space to activists, paid trolls, and bots, as well as agent provocateurs. Many times when you're watching a YouTube video that has information related to finance, you can spot Astroturf bot conversations that advertise for some financial guru. And you can tell by how amicable the thread is, how they talk to each other in a way that shows substantial experiential overlap, touting the same financial expert, almost like they're in a cult and using their own jargon language. This isn't how real people interact, especially on the web where a whole range of views and dispositions can be represented. But yeah, there are whole 40 comment threads that are the same AI bot, start to finish, trying to construct the illusion of consensus. And people look for consensus and want to join and therefore trust. But it's assumed that the average person lacks the pattern recognition skills to see that this is not a real conversation, just a bunch of bots who are practically completing each other's sentences in a comment section. A real comment section is going to have a few people hurling insults, a few people trolling, a few people asking questions, and a few people putting forth good information. In a way, the internet is like the world. The physical world allows for the interaction of beings who would occupy different strata in the subtle dimension. In the physical world, people are windows that open to different strata of the astral. I had talked about how thoughts are like fish that congregate at different depths in the water column. Those thoughts are projected into reality through human beings. Those human beings may occupy the same physical space, but their inspiration comes from different vibrational levels in the subtle realm. They are inspired by different ideas that arise from different states of being that correspond to levels of delusion, of vibration, the product of delusion or the lack of delusion. The physical world is projected into the astral through our sense data that's projected by the brain and the dreams that are spun from it. And the astral world is projected into the physical. Animals are not informed by the same inner voice as people. This is why animals are not the creators of novelty in the sense that we are. They are not compelled by an inner voice that judges the status quo to be inadequate. That voice connects its identity to the thought, I, the root from which grows the tree of conditioning called a person. The strata of the astral realm to which the person is a window depends on what's held in mind and how strongly and unconsciously it's identified with. So the physical world reflects the astral and vice versa. But in humans, it's the physical that's moved by the astral to the extent that subtle formations in consciousness gain purchase on emotions through the ignorance of body identification. The thing that separates the world of man from the natural world is that the world of man draws inspiration from content that arises in the subtle realm. And the natural world takes its cues from reality, from the truth of what is. I've talked in the past about my old roommate, Frank. When I was about 18, I had a 3-bedroom house with a couple other guys who, in the middle of the lease, moved out on me to live with their girlfriends. And Frank was an older guy who I knew in the music scene. He was a piano player. But he had interests beyond music, such as spirituality, metaphysics. He would read tarot cards for people. And he had an understanding of mysticism. This was before the days of the internet, and so the average person had absolutely no idea what this man was talking about, especially an 18-year-old. So he was talking to me about the third eye and pranayama and teaching me about this at a time when it wasn't easy to know what that was. So there were 2 questions that I remember him posing to me over 30 years ago. First was he asked me about the difference between humans and animals. My answer at the time was surface level, but over the years I have pondered the question more and realized it has more to do with novelty than the ways that we express ourselves. There's no such thing as a generation gap for animals. So with humans, it is the idea of a personal self that has an interest in changing the world to meet its ideal. And the second question he posed was, now mind you, this was in like 1995, what humans would do in a circumstance where work was no longer required. And my answer at the time, being just an extrapolation of human behavior that I observed in myself and others, was that they would just become decadent, basically. And I still think that that's a correct answer. But at the time, I would not have been able to say whether or not for any individual this had to be the case. But things that are too abundant lose their value. You can become jaded on practically anything. So the ability to not self-destruct in the face of such easy abundance comes from the ability to be happy in the face of unlimited deprivation. But it's not that deprivation itself that creates this ability, but rather to not suffer the delusion that gives circumstance purchase on the emotions. Because in that delusion is the belief that acquisition and experience create happiness, when in fact they do not. But a well-balanced life can maintain that illusion, but one where extreme abundance is introduced gives the opportunity to test it and therefore dispel it. And this is what the Buddha experienced when his parents locked him away in the pleasure palace. After realizing this and that they were suffering outside of the walls, he departed the palace and ended up following the ascetic path, which did not reveal the end of suffering. Instead, he discovered the middle way, which would allow one to be the same in both abundance and deprivation.